Well, hey, Beyond, as you take this month to refresh and recharge, we wanted to do something that we haven't done before. As we launch into 2026 and our theme for the year, from hello to home, helping people go from their first hello with Beyond to finding a place that they can call home, whatever home looks like for them on their spiritual journey. We wanted to take this opportunity where you may have a little more margin during the month of January to share with you some leadership content. This content comes from our network of churches, the Irresistible Church Network, and it comes specifically from a conference that they run every year called Drive Conference. Our hope is that this content gets you thinking about the ways that we can create a church that is both welcoming for people who have been in church for a long time, but also that's accessible and engaging for people who are brand new to faith, have questions about faith, or maybe coming back to church for the first time in a very, very long time. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to release 4 different episodes from Drive Conference, and we hope that it inspires you and challenges you in your leadership. And if you're not on a team yet, then I want to encourage you, sign up for 2026 in the link below and help us take as many people as possible from their first hello to finding a home.
Hey, I'm so excited you get to meet my friend, Dr. John Dickson. I bumped into John on a podcast. I think it was the Dallas Seminary podcast. He was being interviewed. Actually, Sandra, I think, saw it first, right? You said you got to listen to this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, who is this guy? And he was talking about his book, Bullies and Saints. And if some people ask me all the time, Andy, you talk a lot about history. Is there like a history book? There are so many great history books. But if you just want to start, this is the place to start. So anyway, I got after listening to the podcast, I got the book, I read the book. I'm like, oh my goodness, I want our whole church to read this book. And I thought, oh, I have a better idea. I'll just invite the author to come to our church. And then I found out he lived in Australia. And we didn't quite have the budget to bring in a guest speaker from Australia. And then we have a mutual friend who said, hey, if you'll hang on, he's moving to the United States. I'm like, that seems like a really good stewardship move right there to me. So we waited for him to move to the United States, and I reached out to John and I said, hey, would you come? And I would love to interview you about the content of your book. So he came and we had this wonderful interview on a Sunday morning, and I got to know him, and I'm like, he's just such the real deal and so great. And then a few weeks later, or months later, I can't remember, I'm like, oh my goodness, Johnny, he needs to come to Drive, okay? So then I invited him to Drive, and I was gonna interview him about the book, and then I started to listen to all of his other content. I'm like, there's so much to choose from. I said, I got a better idea. I want everybody to read the book, but I want you to talk about something else, okay? So he came to the United States to serve at Wheaton University, where he is the Gene Kwame, I get it, the Gene Kwame Distinguished Professor of Biblical Studies and Public Christianity, which means he's the smartest person in the room, and he hates it when I say that. But anyway, he's also the creator and the host of the John Dickson podcast, the Undeceptions podcast, which I highly recommend, especially in the world we live in and the culture we live in, because he has extraordinary guests, the Undeceptions podcast. You want to check that out as well. So anyway, as I said, I was going to invite him for an interview, and I'm like, no way. I'm just gonna give you the microphone and cut you loose. So would you please welcome your brand new friend, John Dickson.
Thank you so much.
A lot of introduction.
Thank you, Andy. When Andy invited me to speak here, I said an instant yes. Because I have 2 groups I love being with and love speaking to. One is those who don't yet believe, who just aren't sure what to make of the Christian faith. And the other group is local church workers who are doing all they can to reach that first group. So when he said, we've got a group, like 1,000 people, like Mike and Emma that we just heard from, who are doing all they can to reach those who aren't sure what to make of the faith, I said yes. But then he had to call me a few months later, just after he'd received all that love mail from Evangelical America. Do you remember that? That was nice. And he said, do you really still want to come to Drive? I said, absolutely. Because you guys in local church work are at the very forefront of public Christianity in this country. and in British Columbia and everywhere else. And I believe there's one Australian pastor here, so fantastic, other than me. So what I'm saying is thank you, Andy, for the privilege, and thank you for what you do. I miss being a local church pastor. I was a senior pastor for 10 years, and I still feel the tug to get back to it, maybe one day when I grow up. In 2008, I was involved in a very public debate in Australia, which changed the way I think about Christianity in public. The motion under discussion was we'd be better off without religion. And you can be sure the religion that they were really discussing was Christianity. To many, the bully in the room. And there were 3 professors arguing against the motion that we'd be better off without Christianity, and 3 professors arguing for the motion. The debate was held in a really popular auditorium in the centre of Sydney, about 1,000 people in attendance, and they decided to take an entrance poll to see if people already agreed or disagreed with this motion. And then after the debate, an exit poll to see if there'd been any movement. And I'm ashamed to say, we absolutely lost this debate, both the entrance and the exit poll. It was something like 600 to 400. 60% thought we'd be better off without all that mumbo jumbo. And I came away from this evening pondering with a little more clarity something that I'd been trying to put my finger on for some years. It used to be very common for people in Australia, and I guess here, to say that the problem with Christianity is that it's too moral, moralistic, holier than thou, too good. I want to live my life. But now it is just as common, and where I come from, even more common, to hear people say, the problem with Christianity is that it is bad. It is evil, bigoted, and hated, and we need to get rid of it. That may seem dramatic, but I think that's something of the tone that we experience. Ipsos, a few years ago, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, did an international poll of 20 countries and asked them a similar question to the one in the debate. Do you agree or disagree with the statement, religion does more harm in the world than good? And as you can see, 4 in 10 Americans said, yep. Think about that. The greatest Christian nation on earth, that's your reputation, 4 in 10 think you've done more harm than good. A spare a thought for Australia, we came in equal second, worst. 6 in 10 think religion does more harm in the world than good. And the seeming losses mount. And if you follow the sociology, you'll know this stuff perhaps better than I do. But Gallup poll has been tracking church membership since 1940. People who just say that they're members of a church. And what's astonishing is from 1940 to 2000, the drop in those saying that they're a member of the church was only 3% drop. But since 2000 to 2020, look at that, a 23% drop. Something is really changing. And actually, even if it is 47% of Americans who say in some way that they are a member of a church, it's only 32% of Americans who attend church regularly. And this is depressing for anyone in local church ministry. Now sociologists define regularly as up to once a month. And how depressing is that? But the sociologists know the reality, and so you're regular if you go once a month. But it's perhaps even worse than that. Pew has been tracking those who identify as Christian. And this includes all the brands and all the nominals. And over the last 15 years, or 14 years, there's been a 15% decline. down to 63% in 2021, who say that they are some kind of Christian. That is a dramatic drop. And I don't mean to depress you, but that's almost exactly the same trajectory as Australia. Australia has been on the same decline. Back in 2011, 61% of Aussies said, in some ways, I'm vaguely naming myself as a Christian. But now it's a clear minority, down to 44%. And often Australians will say, we're 10 to 15 years behind America on everything. You know, fashion, economics, technology. But we're 10 to 15 years ahead of you on secularization. Greetings from the future, friends. And I want to offer some observations that aren't really from the future, but come from my context as I read the scriptures. And I want to say that I think that there are some temptations that face us in local church work when we feel like we're losing in this statistical way. And these temptations, they hinder our work in reaching those who don't believe. And the first temptation is what you might call dooming. And I just mean just focusing on the bad. And you might instantly be thinking, John, you've just done that for 10 minutes. But actually, some people are drawn to sort of focus on how bad things are, how post-Christian America is, because there's some sort of energy that you can work up by emphasizing the bad. And you know, there are some Christian sociologists in this country and where I come from who actually trade on the bad. And they get loads of gigs with churches to talk about how bad things are. And we respond like, you know, we're driving down the highway and we see a car wreck. We can't help ourselves looking at it. Dooming. The problem with dooming is that it paralyzes us. It can anyway. And it can give rise to some other temptations like retreating. And I don't mean to be sort of too down on this idea, but there are people who say, as a tactical maneuver, we need to just retreat a little bit. We've been annoying for 2 decades. So let's sort of keep quiet and stop annoying people. Let's be godly. Let's be theological and biblical, but let's think of ourselves more like a monastery. Together, being community, praying, doing good, and just inviting people to come and climb up the mountain over the walls and in to enjoy fellowship with us. Retreating. And then there's the opposite error that I think comes from a different kind of personality, and that's what you might call attacking. Attacking the culture, attacking pagan Canada. Sorry, shout out to Mike and Emma. Or pagan America. And the logic behind the kind of attacking model is, it's like you think of America as a backsliding Christian. And just as a pastor would, you know, go and admonish a backsliding Christian, sometimes the church thinks we've got to admonish the nation. And the image in their mind of the church in society isn't monastery, it's Ezekiel, right? It's the prophet attacking the covenant people who ought to know better. I guess the theological question is that really the right model? Is America really covenant people who ought to know better? Or are they now Athenians at the Areopagus? So friends, I want to suggest there is no need, and indeed no justification, for dooming, retreating, or attacking. Actually, I want to suggest we are right now at the perfect point for public Christianity, making Christ public. Because two things are going on at the same time, and it creates a friction and an energy that I think is exciting. There is an enduring plausibility because of the Christianization of America and Canada and even Australia from the past, an enduring plausibility for Christianity combined with a rising contestability. And it's these two things together, when they collide, that actually creates opportunities. I know Jamie finds this to be true in Ireland. I find it to be true still in Australia, and I'm sure it's true here. Because any more Christian, and Christianity isn't sort of controversial enough to be part of the discussion. There's no energy, no spark. But any more post-Christian, and it's like we've left Christianity completely in the rearview mirror. But no, we are at this mixed point of enduring plausibility and increasing contestability, and it's exciting. The opportunities, if we're willing to jump up and get in, are just wonderful. So in this mixed context, I want to offer a mixed approach that I think arises from Scripture itself. Instead of dooming, retreating, or attacking, may I suggest we foster a cheerful confidence to stand up for Christ in every setting, and a cheerful humility to lose well if we must. These two things together seem to me to be the biblical double demeanor of the church in society, especially a society that's critical of the church. And we could turn to the Gospels, and I think we'd see this. The book of Acts, we'd certainly see this. The letters of Paul, and we'd see this double demeanor. But I want to turn to the little letter of 1 Peter. Because 1 Peter was written to Pontus and Bithynia, what we call northern Turkey, at a period in the sort of middle 60s AD when it was hotting up for Christians. They were just beginning to get a profile across Turkey. People were noticing them, and it was causing sparks. Indeed, we know from Peter himself that they were going through what he calls a fiery ordeal. He doesn't give much details other than people were slandering them and mocking them in public. But here's a little historical thing that's just for free this morning. We know how bad it got. What Peter didn't know when he wrote this letter is that about 40 or 50 years later, it would become a full-on catastrophe in this exact region to which he wrote. And we know this because we have a letter from Governor Pliny the Younger to the emperor of the time, Trajan. And from Pliny's letter, we know that Christians have been booming everywhere. He complains to the emperor that they are found in the cities and the villages throughout Pontus and Bithynia. He says, I find them among the high class and the low class. There are men and women. He even says at one point, I tried to get to the bottom of Christianity by grabbing hold of 2 slave women whom they called deacons, whatever that means, and I tortured them to get the bottom of Christianity. And then in part of the letter to the emperor, he writes this, and I quote it just so you can get a sense of how bad things got eventually for the people to whom Peter wrote. Pliny to Emperor Trajan. I dismissed any who denied that they were Christians when they had repeated after me a formula calling upon our gods and made offerings of wine and incense to your statue, and furthermore had reviled the name of Christ. Don't you love this line? None of which things I understand any genuine Christian can be induced to do. I ask them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time. We are just Romans. We're Justus Romans, right? With a warning of the punishments awaiting them. And if they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. This, friends, was happening to the children of the initial recipients of 1 Peter. Wow, how they must have been drawing on this letter for wisdom. So, as I read the central section of 1 Peter, listen out for these 2 themes. Cheerful confidence to stand up for Christ, and cheerful humility to lose well if we must. Finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit the blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior may be ashamed of their slander. The temptation in Peter's day amongst the people to whom he wrote must have been to doom, to retreat. Maybe some of them thought, let's attack. But instead, Peter says, you know what? I want to urge cheerful confidence to stand up for Christ in every setting. What I love about these famous words is that Peter is adamant and absolute. Do you notice the always and everyone? Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone. I mean, you might have thought, most times, depending, give an answer to the sort of people that might be willing to listen. No, always everyone. And it almost looks like Peter and Paul got together to make sure they said the same thing when they wrote to their congregations who were being persecuted and feeling the pressure. Because look what Paul says to the Colossians. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Answer always everyone. From both apostles. And I love the way Peter doesn't just command this. You must do this, right? It's your Christian duty to answer everyone always. No, he gives the rationale. He gives the reason. You can have confidence to do it because the logic is really important. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. Man, oh man, it must have been frightening. But look what he says. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Or in other translations, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. And then he says, always be prepared to give an answer. Do you see the connections? A heart filled with the glory, majesty of Jesus Christ. And it's even clearer in the original language because this is actually one sentence that the NIV helpfully puts in two shorter sentences, but it's one sentence. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer to everyone. Do you see the logic? There is an intimate connection between the degree to which you have set apart Christ as Lord in your heart and the degree to which you'll be willing to stand up for him. And the reason this is so important is because the way to inspire our people to stand up for Christ in what seems like an increasingly tense situation here in America and elsewhere isn't to command them to do so. Commands can just sort of produce action out of guilt. But the key is for them to know who Christ really is, that they see him above all things, and then they'll be willing to give an answer to the best of their ability. And it's interesting that Jesus in the Great Commission did the same thing. He didn't just command go. He gave the rationale that makes it logical and beautiful to go. As Andy said yesterday, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go. The going, the standing up, the speaking up for all of us arises not from a command, but from a fresh vision of Christ's majesty over all things. You know, there are all sorts of reasons our people in our churches are a little bit shy about the faith right now. For some, it's fear of being labeled, you know, fundamentalist or whatever. For others, they're insecure about the intellectual basis of the Christian faith. They're worried people will ask them tricky questions. Sure. Others are just shy personalities. You know, they can hardly tell a joke in public, let alone that Jesus lived, died, and rose again for you. But whatever the reasons for Christian coyness, the antidote is right here. A fresh vision of who owns the room, every room. Not just this safe room, but at the cafe with the skeptical barista, at Thanksgiving lunch with the grumpy atheist uncle, at work with people who are mocking Christianity for something some public figure said. In every room, if we can inspire our people, not to just think of a command, oh, I always have to stand up for Christ. No, but with a fresh vision of who owns the room, so that their instinct in every tricky situation is to take a breath and go, Jesus owns this room too. Jesus owns this room. And the degree to which we have helped them see Christ over all will be the degree to which they will always be prepared to give an answer to everyone. But right alongside this cheerful confidence, Peter urges a cheerful humility to lose well. And you might think, aren't you now contradicting what you just said about confidence? I mean, you might think in other settings that confidence would produce a kind of boldness and even maybe a harshness, a willingness to turn up the volume, to punch back as hard as we get, yeah? That might be true if our goal was political or even cultural or legislative or moral. But think about this. How does punching back as hard as you get seem logical when our mission is actually to win hearts and minds to the one who gave himself for them? How does that compute? So right alongside cheerful confidence to stand up is this cheerful humility to lose well. And we all know, don't we, that often the punchiest person isn't the confident person, it's the insecure person. Any teachers in the room? School teachers, yeah? You know, don't you, that the school bully is rarely a confident person, they're usually insecure. And the bullying is kind of compensation. A truly assured Christian community doesn't need to punch back. It learns to lose well. Confident, here's the key, confident that Christ has already won. He was crucified by the greatest power the world had ever known. And then the true greatest power raised him from the dead. That's what Peter is going on about here. When you know that Christ has died and been raised to life, there is no attack. There's cheerful humility. Because we are the death and resurrection people. That's our message, that's our vibe. When we know Christ has already won, we can repay evil with blessing, can't we? It's the insecure person that has to repay evil with evil. We can suffer for what is right instead of claiming our rights. And we can count it all blessed. And even when people maliciously speak against us and slander us, how do we answer people? I love the way Peter phrases this. He says, always answer everyone. And you might think he'd say with boldness and punchiness, and he says, but with gentleness and respect. Because there's no other way to commend Christ than with gentleness and respect. This is losing well. And of course, where did Peter get all this idea? Any guesses, wild guesses? The Sunday school answer is the right one. He got it from Jesus. Peter, writing to the people of Pontus and Bithynia, he's thinking of what Jesus had told him when he was there to hear this stuff. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Or in Luke, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and bless those who curse you. This is Jesus' language that Peter has now put in his letter. Jesus is the source. Jesus is the model of the good loser. I mean no disrespect in saying this, but Jesus was an awesome loser. He could entrust himself to the Father. He suffered so much insult and betrayal and injustice for the sake of his love for us, for the sake of our sins, that we might be forgiven, knowing that the Father would raise him. My point is, the thing that's meant to shape our public Christianity is nothing other than the gospel of Christ's death and resurrection. Death and resurrection isn't just the message, it's the mode of our work in the world. Just to get nerdy for a second, Friedrich Nietzsche, not a huge fan of the Christian faith, one of the greatest, most influential European atheists ever. And he had quite a lot to say about the birth of Christianity, actually. And one of the things he said was that Christians in the ancient world were meek and mild and humble and loving and didn't retaliate because they were a beaten down dog. And if you kick a dog often enough, the dog just learns to be submissive, right? He made this whole argument that early Christians had a slave morality. That's what he described it as. And this has had a huge influence on the way a lot of sociologists and historians have understood the Christian faith. It's a powerful socio-psychological analysis. Its only problem is that pesky thing we call historical evidence. Because everywhere I turn in the early Christian literature of the first 300 years, you cannot find the beaten down dog mentality amongst the Christians. They actually walked around not like they were losers, but like they had won. And because they thought they'd already won, they felt that they could lose because they'd won. They were the death and resurrection people. And what happened to their Lord is their whole message and their mode of being. They had a victor's mentality. And I hope you don't mind, I can't resist giving you just 2 examples from antiquity of ancient Christians you might not have heard of, but who had a massive influence on the church in this vital early period. One is Tertullian, who was a great rhetorician and became a Christian and used his skills to defend the Christian faith in public, particularly in Carthage in North Africa. When Scapula, the governor of Carthage, around 215, launched a persecution against the Christians. So what does Tertullian do? He writes a public letter to the governor. And I just want to ask you as I read a portion of the letter, if you detect any beaten down dog here. We are neither dismayed nor greatly disturbed at the persecutions we suffer from ignorant men. Since we joined this way of life with the understanding that we pledged ourselves to enter into the present conflicts at the risk even of our own lives, for we are commanded by the teachings of our religion to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. We then, who are saddened by your ignorance, have compassion on human error. We worship one God whom you all know, since nature is your teacher, at whose lightning and thunder you tremble, at whose benefits you rejoice. The rest you yourselves think to be gods, but we know to be demons. So even if you compel us to sacrifice, you will render no service to your gods. I'm not detecting the beaten down dog here. But he's absolutely willing to suffer unjustly with good cheer. And if you read the rest of the letter, it's just fantastic. My other example is one of my favorite writers from the ancient world. Lactantius was, in fact, professor of rhetoric at the elite academy of Nicomedia, which is in Pontus Bithynia, by the way. And he was a Christian teaching in a pagan school. But in 303, what historians call the Great Persecution broke out, and he was sacked. And because Christians were being killed en masse between 303 and 312, he fled. But he didn't quite retreat. He wrote an awesome book defending the Christian faith to his intellectual pagan buddies. And I want to read you a couple of texts that he wrote. Listen to this. Do they, the Roman authorities, try to compel us by talk or by offering any kind of argument? Not at all. They use violence and torture. But worship cannot be forced. It is something to be achieved by talk rather than blows. If their reasoning is sound, let them argue it. If they have any confidence in their truth, let them teach it to us. Let them engage in debate of some such sort with us. Religion must be defended not by killing, but by dying. Not by violence, but by endurance. Lactantius is your classic death and resurrection Christian. And in fact, a little bit later in this same work, he says, actually, all the persecution is just increasing Christians. This is what he says. There is a reason why God lets persecution come upon us. Because many people actually thought Christianity must be bad if the authorities are persecuting it. So that was sort of an argument against Christianity itself. But he says, no, there's a really good reason God lets persecution come upon us. It increases the number of God's people. And it's not difficult to show why and how that happens. Some want to know what that good is, which is defended even unto death, and which is preferred to all the happy, precious things there are in this life. And other people standing by hear us say, amidst the tortures, that we do not sacrifice to stones shaped by human hands, but to a living God who is in heaven. And many realize this is true and take it to heart. Wow. See, for Lactantius, the goal is to persuade hearts to Jesus Christ. It's not to win politics, not to win legislation, not even really to win arguments, but to win humans to trust the Lord. So what looks like a loss can very often be a win in disguise. All the losing of the early Christians was God's secret weapon to turn the Roman Empire on its head. In small ways, in many ways, I have seen this to be true in my own life and ministry, where what felt like losses turned out to be wins. Some years ago, one of my books, A Sneaking Suspicion it's called, was banned by the government. It's a small club. Anyone been banned by the government? It was super, super embarrassing. This book had been a textbook in high schools for like 15 years by then, like 2 decades. It's a book that sort of subtly sort of weaves in a kind of Christian spiritual perspective on all sorts of issues, from sex to science to suffering to the fashion industry and so on. And so it's done some good. But a group of atheists in Sydney were annoyed that this book was still in high schools. So they produced a report that looked like a real official report, and everything had footnotes and all sorts of stuff. And they submitted it to the government, and they critiqued particularly the opening chapter of this book, which was a really subtle, gentle promotion of sexual faithfulness amidst a kind of hookup culture that was everywhere in Australia. And what they argued was that this book promotes a dangerous purity culture and will harm our kiddies. And just like that, the book was gone. And it was announced, a press release from the government. And I started to get calls from radio stations. I had to do a national TV broadcast about it. It was super embarrassing. It was perhaps the most painful public loss I'd ever experienced. But interestingly, I had some really good friends, you need friends like this, who said to me, John, you know how you've always talked about losing well? Why don't you give it a go? And I'll never forget, one of the interviews I did was on the ABC, which is our national broadcaster. And, I had, my friends in my ear, lose well, well. So my approach was, I'm sure the government has students' interests first and foremost, and that's how it should be. But maybe, they'll be able to review it in the future and see it in a better light. That's how I approached the interview. And no sooner had I hung up from that radio interview than I got a call from an unlisted number. I answered, and it's the education secretary. How he had my number, I don't know, but he got it, right? And he said, I just want to thank you. I just heard the ABC interview. Thank you for not bashing us. Would you like to come in for a coffee next week? Yes, sir, I'd like to come for a coffee. So I hung up, went to his offices, sat down. He said, I actually got around to reading your book. And he said to me, bless him, he said, I'd actually like my teenager to read this book. I was like, oh, thank you. But we talked about the book banning only for about 20 minutes. The rest of our hour and a half conversation was about Jesus. He was not a man of faith, but he wanted to talk about Jesus. At the end of the conversation, I thought that would be it. I didn't dare ask him, will you unban the book now? But at the end of the conversation, he said, you want to come back again? I said, yes. I ended up having 4 or 5 coffees with the Secretary for Education where we just talked about Jesus. What felt like a painful loss was a wonderful gospel win. How could I have ever taken the gospel into the government like that? Now, I will say that 6 weeks later, he unbanned my book, and there's nothing like having a banned book to increase sales. But I promise you that is not the win I'm talking about. I am not saying that it ever turns out like that. But the win was I got to share the gospel over and over with this man. There's even a happy addendum to the debate that I mentioned. We lost both votes, the entrance and the exit poll, as I said. But what I didn't say is there was a movement of one, right? If it was 600 against us and 400 on our side, it moved to like 599 to 401. I thought that was a victory. But very small victory, nice of you to say, yeah. And at the after party, this young man was on the edge and he caught my eye and he waved me over, and I went over and he said, I'm the one. Now, I didn't have the heart to say statistically there may have been many going this way and many going that way. But anyway, so yeah, wow, you're the one. So what changed your mind? And he said, it wasn't any of those kind of high-level arguments. It's when someone got up and said to the audience, forget these arguments, think of the one really Christian person in your life and ask yourself the question, would our world be better off with or without that kind of faith? And he said, I have this auntie and she is really Christian. And when I was thinking of the Crusades and the bigots in the media, I thought Christianity was bad. When I thought of my auntie, I thought it's beautiful. Now, I can't tell you, right there and then he gave his life to Christ and now he's a missionary in Mongolia. It's not that kind of story. But I came away thinking, oh man, one by one, what changes hearts and minds is the demeanor of the Christian in public, like his auntie. There's some interesting research from Australia that bears this out. A research company, very well respected in Australia, did a kind of scorecard for Christians in my country. And among the top 10 perceptions of Christians were hypocritical, opinionated, old-fashioned, judgmental, and traditional. Not exactly the Sermon on the Mount, you'll agree. But the top 5 perceptions were all positive: honest, faithful, kind, loving, caring. And when the church got this report card, we thought, how can this be? Is this one cohort that just hates us, and this other cohort that's slightly bigger, that bumps up the numbers, that sort of likes us? And the researchers actually explained to the churches that's not what's going on. These are the same people in the survey saying Christians, hypocrites, judgmental. Oh, Auntie Molly, faithful, loving. It's wins and losses going on all the time at the same time. It's almost as if people have 2 Christianities in their minds at the same time. And it doesn't take much to activate the bully perception of the Christian, because people are sitting there thinking Christians can be bullies and bigots and hateful and da-da-da. But actually there is this echo of a memory of Christianity at its best, which probably comes from Jesus. And it doesn't take much of a kindness and a humility for people to think, oh yeah, that's right, Christians are loving and kind. One of the academics in this debate, the three arguing against the motion that we'd be better off without Christianity, was a professor of Jewish history at Sydney University, our oldest university, and like a lot of old prestigious universities, very secular. But on the night, we defended her Judaism just as we defended Christianity, at both the debate and at the after party. And she was so touched by the way Christians were helping her defend the history of Judaism that a few weeks later, she rang me and said, would you mind coming to Sydney University and give a lecture on Jesus the Jew? I said, fantastic. I went, did it, went well. A few weeks after that, she rang again and said, I have this idea. Would you design and teach an entire semester course on the life of Jesus at Sydney University? Which I did. And sure enough, a couple of years later, I got to teach an entire semester course in a secular university on the life of Jesus for the next 10 or more years. In fact, I was teaching it right up until I moved to America 18 months ago. And my point is, this came from a painful public loss. Let me land this. The gospel calls forth from us a cheerful confidence to stand up for Christ. Always, everyone. And a cheerful humility to lose well, if we must, knowing that we're the death and resurrection people. And losses, good losses, are often wins in disguise. It's nothing other than the gospel embodied in our ministry. I think of the gospel, friends, as a little bit like the most beautiful melody ever composed. And I have Bach on the screen because many musicians will agree that Bach's cello suites are one of the most impressive pieces of music ever composed. And we have a treat for you today because our friend Ishmael is going to play the prelude to the Bach cello suites, which musicologists will say is one of the most mathematically sublime of all the pieces of music ever written. Just to jog your memory, Ishmael, if you'd just play for us 8 bars. That's how Bach expected it to be played. That's the composition and the performance in perfect alignment. On the other hand,
I listened to the cello suites for years, but I'd never picked up a cello until last week.
To judge a piece fairly, we know to distinguish between the masterpiece that was written and the pretty ordinary performance.
yeah, only the non-musicians clapped. What's my point? Friends, we have sometimes played the beautiful melody out of tune, have we not? Jesus wrote a beautiful tune. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who persecute you. And he took it all the way to his own cross. And that's our message and our mode, and sometimes we have not played the tune. But Bach has designed this prelude as if to call us back to beauty, And as you hear the prelude now played properly, I want you to listen out for the way Bach presents us with the beautiful G major in the beginning, one of the most beautiful keys, and then takes us far away to produce in us a longing to get back there. And then he teases us, and then he calls us back to the G in the most beautiful resolution. And as you hear Bach do that, will you hear Christ call you back to the gospel, the beautiful tune? Thank you, Ishmael. Thank Can you feel how far away we are from resolution? Now hear Bach begin to call us back to the making our way back. Hear Jesus call us back to the gospel. Back to the gospel.
I've sat through that 4 times, and it gets me every time. Let's play it well. You're dismissed to your breakouts. We'll see you later on this afternoon.
Well, thanks so much for tuning into that conversation. I hope it inspired you. I hope it challenged you and gave you a little bit of food for thought. And hey, if you're not on a team yet, why don't you jump on a team for 2026 below by clicking the link in the description. We would love to have you part of what we're doing here as we seek to create a church that unchurched people love to engage with, and as we look to help move as many people from that first hello to finding a home.